So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Keng Siong from the DBS Bank in Singapore. And I get the feeling this is going to be a more applied presentation, looking at predicting future sovereign defaults based on their past history. So thank you very much. Looking forward to this talk.
Thank you very much, Professor Gray. Can everybody hear me clearly? Yeah. Let me just begin by doing a little bit of self-introduction. I have been spending last 20 years, or most of the last 20 years in the bank, looking at the credit and country risk. The main part of my portfolio, until maybe about 2 years ago, was in the area of sovereigns and lending to sovereigns. So this is an area that is very close to my heart because of the amount of time I spent on it. So I decided to do a doctoral dissertation on this. So later on, I will show you the picture. Let me just share screen first. Um, so this is the picture of myself at the conference presenting what else about country risk and my supervisor. And so let me just go on quickly. I will turn off the camera for myself because I usually find it a bit distracting. And hopefully I can finish in time for the next speaker without taking too much of his time. So let me just begin. So my presentation will cover very little about Stata and more about the area of my research passion. I'm going to spend a little bit time on background and then what are the issues involved. There are specifics about the data, which I think is part of the challenge in this piece of work that I've done. And then I will present the findings uh, towards the end. So in terms of the area of sovereign defaults, um, firstly, a sovereign is an entity, a legal entity, a country. So when countries borrow, there are certain features of their borrowing patterns which, uh, firstly, financial markets like to lend to sovereigns because in a in a country, the best credit in the country is usually the sovereign or the central bank or the government. So they are considered good credits compared to other commercial borrowers. They are known as low default probability. So in the area of BIS stands for the Bank for International Settlement. It is the so-called regulators of all regulators or central banks of all central banks. And according to Basel, a sovereign portfolio is what is known as a low default probability portfolio, which means that compared to commercial borrowers, they tend to default a lot less. But there is a little bit of a conflict between the regulator's view and what we practitioners see. So let me just show you a example of what we in the market call serial defaulters. Top of the list is Argentina, a country which I guess a lot of us like to lend money to, but a lot of us dislike because they almost or they regularly refuse to pay. And then you go down the list. So if you look at the list of maybe 200 over sovereigns in the world, quite a number of them, and this list that I have is not comprehensive. Quite a number of them actually do default on their payments, which means that they do not pay on time or they simply refuse to pay. The most recent ones will be Argentina yet again. Pakistan is interesting case because Pakistan defaulted only a few times, but they were in IMF program for maybe 13 times. And so why are we still lending to them um, when they show that they don't borrow in good faith? So that's another field which is part of the other part of my uh, uh, dissertation. But this part of the dissertation or this part of the presentation concentrates mainly on looking at historical data and what does the historical data prove to us or disprove, because the regulators somehow seem to stick on to the view that sovereigns are low default probability. And there was earlier discussion about use of data for graphical purposes. Unfortunately, I've done this using Excel, so you find that the output is a little bit inferior. But basically, what it maps is that if the way to look at it is that for many years when there is no default, and then suddenly they have default for a few years, and then no default. So you find that in the patterns, and it's generally like this, that especially let's say for instance a country like Canada, for many years there was no default. So one of the reasons could be that because they did not default for many years, that is why the impression given to regulators and to some investors is that they are low risk. So let's settle the issue in a statistical manner to help us check for ourselves whether they do default regularly and whether defaulters default again, which is what is the other part of sovereign default covers. And that is investors, if you look at the way financial markets operate, they always say that this time is different. So when you have a bubble, and then for those of us who are in the financial industry for a long time, we know that before the Asian financial crisis, everybody say that no, it's okay, nobody will go bust, and then we went bust. And then before the global financial crisis, everybody say, oh, U.S. financial system is okay, it's different from all other financial systems, and then the U.S. went bust. It is for these two cases, the sovereigns did not go bust, but the market went bust. And the truth in financial markets is that there is no such thing as this time is different. So there is a very big, there is a bestseller that was sold a few years ago, 10 years ago, by Reinhardt and Rogoff, which examines something like 500 years or 450 years of financial data to prove that there is no such thing as this one is different. And the conclusion, if when the market runs and there's not too much froth in the market, for instance, like what is going on with AI and so on, at some point in time, some people will say that the detractors will say that prices are too high, but the bulls will say that no, this time is different, AI is different, it's the next big thing, and no, the best thing since sliced bread and so on. But when you hear someone start to say this time is different, the advice is that please run, don't walk, run. Get away from the market as soon as possible because the market is going to burst. And the other issue with sovereigns is there's a division in opinions over the role of rating agencies. Those of us who subscribe to rating agency reports and their research and so on find that they tend to be exposed. That means they tell you somebody has defaulted after they have defaulted. And so the role seems to be not very good, not very useful. But again, regulators require us to use rating agency reports and their ratings, which is a fairly sore thing to us who are bankers because we all know that it's better for us to do our own research rather than depend solely on the rating agencies. And you find that the major embarrassments to the rating agencies are the Asian financial crisis, the US subprime crisis, and quite more recently, the European sovereign debt crisis. The European sovereign debt crisis is actually quite interesting because Greece was rated in the A universe for quite a number of years. And then within the space of less than 1 year, the rating agencies went through a series of downgrades to the rating, and eventually Greece went into default. So one of the issues that highlighted is that rating agency ratings may not be very useful. We may need to supplement them with other tools or other ways of telling whether a sovereign is a good bet or not a good bet. And why are sovereign defaults important? It's important because, and the identifying them early is important because, firstly, investment money is involved. Secondly, if a sovereign is heading into default, the aid agencies and the regulators can step in, hopefully, in time. In the case of Greece, nothing could be done because the borrowers refuse to take the necessary actions. But at least if we are able to tell who is a good borrower and who is not a good borrower, we can go in with our eyes open and we can get out hopefully in time before we get ourselves burnt. And the other important things is that why do sovereign defaults matter is, as I said earlier, sovereigns are the best credit in the country. And if the best credit in the country defaults, you can be sure that there is a huge loss in confidence in the creditors or rather the borrowers in the entire country and the entire financial system. Secondly, is that sovereigns are what holds up the banking system. In the banking system, we all route our payments through the central bank, and essentially the central bank supports whoever bank that is in trouble to try to bail them out. And if the sovereign itself requires to be bailed out, then naturally there's not much money, or there probably isn't any money to help anybody else. In the case of borrowing costs, when uh, when a, when you default on, let's say, your credit card or whatever it is, you find that the next time round you want to borrow, it's going to be more difficult. And if bankers were to lend you money, they will demand a higher premium. So that affects borrowing costs overall. The entire country is affected because everybody gets to pay more. And then, of course, the reputational damage that is incurred on the country. Um, Not many people want to invest in Pakistan. Not many people want to invest in Argentina anymore because they consistently fail to pay. And that's the truth. And in terms of financial impact, naturally, you find that the bailout cost for Greece or the European sovereign debt crisis was something in the tune of 310 billion. So 310 followed by 9 zeros. That's a lot of money. The European Financial System Manage EFSF, European Financial Sovereign Stability Fund, is still in operation, which means that 13, 14 years after the bailout, the market, or rather the European Commission or European Community, is still uh, paying off the debt that was incurred. And what happened to the countries that went to default? Greece, the creditors come in. IMF say that if you want me to bail you out, you have to do this, do that. Invariably, it means cutting costs, cutting the sovereign's expenditure. So you find that as a result of this and the collapse in the economy, unemployment shoot up. Um, Greece versus Europe, 28% versus already high for Europe at 11%. And then you find that for those of us who lived through the European sovereign debt crisis, you find that you have the unrest, people protesting in the streets and so on. And it is not only confined to Europe or Greece. Overall, global GDP is affected, and overall, the rest of the world pays for it. The issue here is that Greece, Portugal, and these countries, that Italy, that were involved in the sovereign debt crisis, it was not the first time they went into trouble. They got into trouble before. Um, but now, what can we do about it now that we have more data and we have many years of data to find out how at least we can protect ourselves better? A big part of the literature in sovereign defaults cover why do they default. And one reason that all bankers know is that you cannot sue a sovereign. Let's say, for instance, Greece defaulted, and they say that, and we say that we want to confiscate something in Greece. Do we confiscate the bridge? Can we confiscate a bridge? Can we confiscate the historical relics and so on? So there is no way to enforce your legal rights if you are a lender to a sovereign. If you go to a court, the court may give you judgment in your favor, but how are you going to go to the central bank to open the vault to collect the money? And then the central bank, and it has happened before, the central bank passed a regulation that says that no bank in my country is going to do business with these three banks. Um, so that is why sovereigns can do it and get away with it. And so in terms of sovereign ratings, maybe I will cover a little bit, and that is that rating agencies, I think a lot of us are familiar with the ABC methodology they use. Moody's use a combination of A and number. I will show you later on what the rating scale looks like. So the rating agencies issue ratings for which they will express opinion what the sovereign credit standing is. The methodologies are almost invariably uh, proprietary. That's how they sell their ratings. But studies show that there are certain common factors like GDP growth, inflation, debt, and the rating agencies themselves also have found that default history is a factor. What it means is that if a country has defaulted before, chances are you will get a poorer rating. So it is already imputed into the rating agency's ratings. It's just that how we tease up this in terms to find out more from the ratings and from more from the default history to build an better metric for it. So this time the research is different because unlike other rating research, um, most of the research into rating agency ratings is what they do, what is called bond shadow rating. In that is, they try to find ways to replicate the rating agency's ratings. And then and the implicit assumption is that the rating agencies already got it correct, which is why I want to see what are the factors that can replicate the rating agency rating. So what I'm doing is that I look it from the other way, that from the sovereign default, what does the sovereign default tell us about the ability or willingness to pay? Right? So the research question is split into hypotheses. One is a null hypothesis: country with a past default is likely to default again. And the alternative hypothesis is that the sovereign default has no impact on future. The database spent a little bit of time collecting 183 countries. Fortunately, was published by Reinhardt and Rogoff, but it's up to 2014 only. The data series dates back to 1800. So what I have done was that I purchased data from two sources to update them to 2013. And the reason why I purchased this data is also to validate and cross-check that the data that I have is good enough to use, because the research is only as good as the data that I have. And the data preparation is that creation of a dummy variable. And firstly, we need to define what the sovereign default is. This is quite simple with the Reinhardt and Rogoff database because they have already populated based on a certain definition. The updated dating of the data requires me to look at the definitions of default by the three rating agencies. Fitch is D or RD, S&P is D or SD, Moody's does not assign a specific rating for default. So this is a presentation or show you how a typical rating scale looks like. At the bottom of the scale, you look at this word called default. This is where, oops, yeah. So D is what the bottom of the scale is from the 22 scale this thing. Um, the important thing to note about sovereign defaults is the feature of the data which affects the investigation that we do, is that a sovereign default is binary. You at any one time you can only be in default or you are not in default. So the population of the data requires, or population of the data series requires the creation of the dummy variable, which I call default count. So the dummy variable will have only a 1 or a 0 assigned to it. Um, so this is the way I have populated it, based on the default series that I have and the data that I purchased. And then from this, there, there is a need to specify what test that I have done. So my null hypothesis is specified as a regression in which the point to be tested is actually, or what is to be tested is that the default count is regressed against the lag of itself. So the lag is generated by Stata. I will show you. It is fairly simple. Uh, so one of the ways is you just take the code out. It is fairly simple to get it out from Stata from the FAQs and so on. So it's not too difficult task at all. And then I have defined 10 years. Why 10 years? Is because the more years you use, the more data is consumed. So 10 looks like a reasonable number. It is purely judgmental. And because it is a categorical data where only two conditions exist, we cannot use standard linear regression. We use what is known as Probit. And Probit is also an available function in Stata, fortunately. If we set it up as a panel data, and then we run the Probit on it, so the code is actually not that difficult. Again, these are standard functions for which you can actually extract out of Stata. It's just arranging the data in a spreadsheet, and then after that, running the preset functions that are available or that are menu driven in Stata. So it is not too difficult, and voila, you will get the data as per the Stata output. And the critical value that I look at is the p-value. So a p-value that is extremely small suggests that a previous default is predictive of a or a current default is a current default is predictive of a future default. And if you look at it, the data shows that uh, the persistence is actually 8 years. So the 8 years after a sovereign default, the sovereign is likely to default again. And this is quite intuitive because it takes years for a sovereign default to be resolved. So it's a multi-year process. After the regulators and the bailout people come in, you take years to do the bailout and rehabilitate your finances, which is why 8 years sounds like quite a good indication. And if the country's finances cannot be repaired within these 8 years, what happens? They default again because they cannot take the pressure of the austerity program, or they find that they really politically they do not have the will to pay off their debts. And then what they do is that they go into default again. Then ninth year is interesting. You find that after year 9, then you find that there is difference. The data is no longer predictive. Year 10, you find that it is still significant at the 95% confidence interval, but the sign is wrong. How do we interpret it? Well, the interpretation is that after the successful implementation of reform programs, the likelihood of a repeat event basically tapers off. So you find that this is seems to be happening in Greece. They now are in a much better shape, and they managed to exit all the build-up programs and access international bond markets again. The conclusion of my research is that a country that has defaulted is likely to default again in the next 8 years. So what do we do with the credit ratings? When we look at the credit ratings, we take a look at it, and especially if countries which are poorly rated, you may want to overlay it with a consideration, like for instance, whether this country has defaulted before in the past 8 years. No country moves from default rating to AAA in one jump. It almost always takes many, many years to graduate from D to C to B and then to A. So if you are looking at a country or sovereign with a B rating, it is useful to take a look at the default history and form a judgment whether you really want to take a second look at putting your money there. Right? And so that is one useful outcome of my research. The other outcome thing is that regulators need to think a little bit more about the computation of capital adequacy for sovereign loans. Sovereigns that have defaulted before, maybe there should be more punitive requirements in terms of setting the capital aside when there is exposure by banks to them. And finally, what are the limitations of this study is that the definition of sovereign default is what is given by Reinhardt and Rogoff and what is given by the rating agencies. There are various definitions, but we are choosing a particular definition. So if you use another definition, you may get a different result. This is purely a statistical study, so it still doesn't really fully explain why sovereigns like to default again and again. Maybe we have to ask the Argentinians why they do that. And near misses, that means a country that went in almost defaulted but didn't default. Countries like Portugal, Italy, during a sovereign debt crisis, they were at the brink of default, but they did not default. So the data doesn't capture them. How to do it will be a statistical challenge, I guess, to do a rationale to do another dissertation, which yeah, an idea. Okay, maybe I stop here for questions. Sorry
Thank you
to
very.
rush it. Yeah,
No, sorry, you continue.
I'm done.
Thank you very much for what was a very interesting presentation. One of the joys of being an applied biostatistician is you get to encounter a huge range of subject areas and topics, and this is obviously something that I wouldn't have encountered in health sciences, so thank you very much for that. I know that we started a little bit late and you did a great job at getting through in time, but I think we probably won't have any time for questions, but perhaps if people can email you if they want to discuss this more. So thank
Yeah,
you. Yeah, thank you
you
very
can
much.
email
Yes,
me. Yeah, okay,
yes,
thank you.
yes. Thank you very much.
Bye.